Good evening. What unfolded in the last 48 hours did not shift the balance of power. It tilted it, not because Putin repeated a familiar warning, but because the tone, the timing, and the context revealed something new, something the United States and NATO interpreted not as rhetoric, but as the opening note of escalation. The moment the Kremlin released his message, NATO reacted with a speed that told its own story. Surveillance aircraft lifted into the night, quiet readiness cycles ran on nuclear-capable airfields. Border alerts sharpened. Cyber units moved into defensive posture. And Washington issued coordination orders, usually reserved for moments when miscalculation becomes a genuine threat. These actions do not activate for theatrics. They activate when intelligence agencies believe a warning carries operational weight. And this time, they believed it. Because Russia now sees NATO's involvement in Ukraine not as assistance, but as battlefield shaping. And when a great power believes the strategic board is turning against it, hesitation dies first. So tonight, we unpack why this moment feels different, why both sides move faster than usual, and why uncertainty itself has become the most dangerous weapon in Europe. Because if this shift continues, the next signal may not be verbal at all. Here are the hard facts that define the past 48 hours, stripped of spin and diplomacy. First, NATO moved faster than at any other point in recent memory. Surveillance aircraft were pushed into continuous rotation. Nuclear-capable airfields ran silent readiness cycles. Cyber defense units in Germany shifted to elevated posture. These steps are rarely synchronized unless intelligence agencies see a credible escalation signal. Second, Eastern Europe responded with visible urgency. Poland raised border alert levels. Norway activated additional Arctic monitoring assets. These measures reveal how frontline states interpreted Putin's message, not as a warning, but as preparation for broader pressure. Third, the United States adjusted its own footprint. Washington issued quiet coordination orders to select forces in Europe, the kind that indicate contingency planning for scenarios officials prefer not to discuss publicly. These orders only surface when the risk of miscalculation increases sharply. Fourth, Russia altered its physical posture in parallel. Satellite imagery captured missile brigades shifting toward the western frontier. Long-range aviation commands activated personnel unexpectedly. Naval patrol patterns changed in ways that suggest deliberate ambiguity. This ambiguity forces NATO to prepare for multiple potential paths at once. And finally, intelligence leaks in Moscow showed a shift in mindset. Senior Russian security officials now argue that the West is no longer trying to deter Russia, but to weaken it permanently. If this belief solidifies, escalation becomes a strategic necessity rather than a political choice. These five facts form the backbone of the current crisis. They explain the speed, the anxiety, and the silence behind official statements. And they push us toward a deeper question: what mechanism is driving this escalation spiral? To understand why the past 48 hours escalated so quickly, we need to look at the mechanism underneath the headlines. At its core, the crisis is driven by a collision of strategic interpretations that neither side believes it can afford to change. From Moscow's perspective, NATO is no longer supporting Ukraine. It is shaping the battlefield. Long-range strikes, precision targeting, and intelligence coordination have blurred the line between proxy support and direct operational influence. For Russia, that shift is existential. Great powers do not tolerate rival great powers steering events on their borders. Inside NATO, the mechanism looks different, but just as urgent. The alliance sees Putin's warning not as political theater, but as a sign that Russia believes its long-term security position is deteriorating. When a state feels cornered, its risk tolerance increases. That is the moment deterrence becomes unstable. Stability requires predictability, and predictability disappears the second both sides begin recalculating red lines at the same time. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. NATO increases support to stabilize Ukraine. Russia interprets that support as encirclement. Russia escalates posture to regain initiative. NATO interprets that escalation as preparation for broader confrontation. Each step is defensive in intention, but offensive in interpretation. That is the mechanism. Mirrored fear. Each side is acting to prevent disadvantage, yet each action produces the very pressure the other side is trying to avoid. The stakes come from this symmetry. If Russia believes NATO has crossed an irreversible line, then restraint becomes harder to justify. If NATO believes Russia is shifting into pre escalation posture, then unity and readiness must tighten. And if both sides feel the geopolitical board is tilting against them simultaneously, then even routine military movements acquire strategic meaning. This is why the past 48 hours matter, not because of a single statement, but because both sides responded as if the margin for error has narrowed. And when margins shrink, scenarios multiply. There are three scenarios now shaping how NATO, the United States, and Russia prepare for the next phase of this crisis. They are not predictions, they are pathways, each defined by signals already emerging on the ground. The first is the best case scenario, though it is fragile. In this path, both sides maintain heightened readiness, but avoid taking steps that shift the military balance further. NATO continues support to Ukraine at current levels. Russia maintains ambiguity, but holds off on operational escalations. The situation stays tense but stable. Two triggers would strengthen this track. Limited Russian communication traffic around strategic bases returning to normal, and NATO scaling back high-tempo surveillance flights. A third reinforcing sign would be Ukraine moderating strike patterns, signaling an attempt to reduce escalation pressure. But this scenario depends entirely on restraint, and restraint is the rarest commodity in moments like this. The second scenario is the base case. It assumes the crisis continues tightening without breaking. Under this path, Russia increases pressure through non-kinetic means: cyber probes, airspace intrusions, expanded naval patrols. NATO responds with rotational deployments in Eastern Europe and sustained intelligence support to Ukraine. Washington maintains contingency posture but avoids irreversible steps. Triggers for this scenario include more Russian missile brigades shifting closer to Western regions, additional NATO border alerts, and renewed Russian activity across long-range aviation networks. This scenario is the most likely because it reflects the existing pattern: pressure without rupture. The final scenario is the worst case, and its danger lies in how easily it could emerge from misinterpretation rather than intent. Here, Russia concludes NATO has crossed a permanent threshold and acts to reassert initiative through a visible military escalation. That escalation does not need to be an attack, a high alert nuclear drill, a forward deployment of tactical systems, or a sudden maritime blockade in the Black Sea would be enough to force NATO into a countermove. Triggers for this path include Russia activating additional strategic communication channels, NATO shifting nuclear-capable assets into forward readiness, or Ukraine conducting a long-range strike interpreted as Western-enabled beyond Moscow's tolerance. In this scenario, what begins as signaling becomes momentum, and momentum becomes commitment. The reason these three scenarios matter is simple. All are already forming. Pieces of each one have appeared in the last 48 hours. And as the signals blend, the risk is no longer that one side escalates deliberately, but that both sides escalate reactively. When signals blur, decisions harden. Before we assume the crisis is accelerating toward a breaking point, we need to confront the strongest counterarguments, because not every signal is as decisive as it appears. The first counterargument is that Russia may be exaggerating its sense of threat for political leverage. Moscow has a long history of framing NATO actions as existential to justify internal consolidation. If this warning follows that pattern, then the rapid movements we have seen are less about imminent escalation and more about reinforcing Putin's domestic narrative. But even this possibility has limits, because NATO's intelligence reaction suggests they detected operational cues behind the rhetoric. The second counterargument is that NATO's response could reflect caution rather than concern. High-tempo surveillance, cyber defense shifts, and border alerts might be expressions of prudence, not panic. However, the synchronization across multiple NATO members indicates this was more than routine precaution. Caution alone rarely produces alignment this tight. The third counterargument focuses on Ukraine. Some analysts argue that Kyiv is overstating its momentum and that Russia's warning is meant to slow Western enthusiasm, not signal deeper confrontation. But Ukraine's interpretation does not drive NATO posture. Intelligence does. And that intelligence clearly pointed to changes within Russian strategic signaling. Now, for the limits of what we know, we do not have full visibility into Russian internal debate. We cannot confirm whether missile brigade shifts are temporary or structural. We cannot determine whether increased communication traffic reflects preparation or signaling, and we cannot measure how much of NATO's posture is deterrence versus genuine concern. These uncertainties define the problem. What we know is concerning. What we do not know may matter even more. And this sets up the real question. What does all of this mean for the trajectory of the war and the stability of Europe? So, what does all of this actually mean for the trajectory of the war, for the stability of Europe, and for the long-term shape of US-Russia relations? It means the crisis is no longer defined by battlefield movements. It is defined by perception, interpretation, and strategic fear. Russia believes NATO is encircling it. NATO believes Russia is preparing for escalation. And the United States believes hesitation now carries the same risk as acting too boldly. When every side sees danger in opposite directions, the system becomes unstable by design. It also means Europe has entered a new strategic era. The continent is learning that indirect war between great powers can be just as dangerous as direct confrontation. Support to Ukraine strengthens deterrence, yet it also raises the possibility of misinterpretation. Every reinforcement, every radar sweep, every shift in posture now carries symbolic weight far beyond its tactical purpose. For Ukraine, the meaning is double-edged. Momentum brings opportunity, but opportunity invites risk. The country must push forward without triggering a response that reshapes the conflict entirely. That balance is narrowing by the week. But the biggest implication is this. Both sides now believe the other is shaping the future against them. That belief makes every warning sharper, it makes every move heavier, and it shortens the distance between signaling and action. Which leads to the question no one wants to answer. If the next signal is not verbal, then what will it be, and who will move first?